swim! No, we have to fight! If we fight, we die! But if we swim, we drown! Okay.
Disney's done it again. They've taken one of the most iconic villains in animation history and tried to give us their origin story. But here's the thing. This time, it's not actually about the villain at all. Mufasa. The Lion King claims to be a prequel, but what it really delivers is something nobody asked for. A backdoor origin story that somehow manages to both explain too much and not enough at the same time. Let's talk about what's actually happening here. Young Mufasa gets separated from his parents and runs across another cub named Taka, who, yes, eventually becomes the Scar we all know. Now, if you're thinking, wait, weren't they supposed to be brothers? Well, that's just the first of many surprises this movie throws at us. Turns out the best family isn't always the one you're born into. It's the one you choose. At least that's what Disney's trying to tell us this time around. The story follows these two cubs as they navigate their way through a world that's way bigger and more dangerous than either of them expected. Mufasa, our future king, spends his time learning from the female lions because apparently he wasn't worthy enough to hang with the males. Meanwhile, Taka, our future Scar, gets his life lessons from what I can only describe as the deadbeat dads of the savannah. Talk about setting up some obvious personality differences. But here's where things get interesting. There's this new pack of lions led by Mads Mikkelsen's character, and they're not just your typical Disney villains. These guys are actually threatening. They're taking over territories, forcing our young cubs to go on the run, and setting up what's supposed to be this epic journey to find the Promised Land, or as we know it, the Pride Lands. The thing is, this movie takes its sweet time getting anywhere. You know how sometimes you're watching something and you can feel every minute passing? That's kind of what's happening here. But before we dive into why that is, we need to talk about what this movie actually gets right. And trust me, there are some genuinely surprising moments that deserve our attention. What's wild is how this film manages to both impress and disappoint in the same breath. The animation, it's stunning. We're talking about visuals so realistic you'll forget you're watching computer-generated images. But is that enough to carry an entire prequel that nobody really asked for? That's what we're going to break down today. Let's start with what everyone's talking about, the animation. You know how the last live-action Lion King caught heat for looking too realistic? Like to the point where the lions couldn't even show basic emotions without breaking the whole realistic vibe. Well, someone at Disney was clearly taking notes. This time around they found this weird sweet spot between National Geographic documentary and actual animated movie. The lions actually emote now, not like full-on cartoon style, but enough that you can tell when they're doing more than just existing on screen. There's this scene where Mufasa, our future king, has to prove himself by basically pulling off some daredevil-level parkour moves across these cliffs. The way they animated it, you can actually see the uncertainty in his eyes, the determination in his movements, and yeah, even a hint of that leadership quality we know he'll eventually have. It's like they finally remembered these aren't just regular lions, they're characters we're supposed to connect with. And speaking of connecting, let's talk about the dynamic between young Mufasa and Taka. This relationship is supposed to be the heart of the movie, but it's complicated in ways that aren't always intentional. Aaron Pierre voices young Mufasa, and he's actually doing something pretty clever here. Instead of trying to do a young James Earl Jones impression, which, let's be honest, would have been impossible, he creates this version of Mufasa that you can actually believe grows into the king we know. There's this raw potential in his voice, this hint of authority that's still developing. Then there's Kelvin Harrison Jr. as young Taka, and this is where things get really interesting. As the movie progresses, you start hearing these little hints of the Scar we know he'll become. It's subtle at first, a slight edge to his voice, a certain way he delivers his lines, and then it grows. By the end, you can almost hear echoes of Jeremy Irons in there, even though that's probably just our brains filling in the gaps because we know where this is all heading. The thing is, while they're nailing these technical aspects, there's something else happening that's harder to ignore. The movie keeps introducing characters we know from the original Lion King, and each time it happens, it feels less like organic storytelling and more like they're checking off boxes on a Disney exec's wish list. It's like they're nudging you in the ribs going, remember them? Remember this? You liked this before, right? And yeah, We remember. That's not the issue. The issue is whether we needed to know how every single character met in the first place. Here's what makes this really frustrating. The entire movie is structured as a story that Rafiki is telling to Timon, Pumbaa, and Simba's child. And let me tell you, it takes its sweet time getting started. You're sitting there thinking, okay, when does the actual story begin? While Timon and Pumbaa are doing their usual comedy routine. Don't get me wrong, I love these characters, but when you're 15 minutes into a movie and still haven't gotten to the main plot, something's off. When we finally do get into it, what we're really watching is basically a road trip movie with lions. Our crew keeps picking up new members along the way, all characters we conveniently know from the original Lion King. And while there's nothing inherently wrong with a fellowship-style journey across dangerous lands, I mean, it worked pretty well for a certain trilogy about a ring, the difference is that those movies had stakes beyond just, here's how everyone met. The villainous lion pack led by Mads Mikkelsen should add some urgency to all this, but even they feel more like an excuse to keep our characters moving than an actual threat. Mikkelsen's voice work is solid. The guy could read a phone book and make it sound menacing, but the character itself is about as deep as a puddle in the Pride Lands during dry season. Let's talk about the music, because this is where things get really interesting, and not necessarily in a good way. Lin-Manuel Miranda handled the original songs for this one, and it's definitely Lin-Manuel Miranda music. The problem is, it doesn't feel like Lion King music. You know those moments in the original where the music swells and you get chills? Those moments that are so perfectly Lion King that you can't imagine them any other way. Yeah, you won't find those here. Instead, you get songs that feel like they were written for a completely different movie and somehow wandered into this one by mistake. The familiar themes from the original Lion King, those still hit. Every time you hear even a hint of those classic melodies, something stirs inside you. But that just makes the contrast with the new stuff even more jarring. It's like they're playing two different movies at the same time, and neither one is winning. So here's the thing about Mufasa, the Lion King. It's a movie that exists because a spreadsheet somewhere said it should. When the live-action Lion King became one of the top 10 highest-grossing films of all time, this kind of prequel was inevitable. But being inevitable doesn't make it necessary. Even the way Scar gets his name feels forced and awkward. Which is wild, because how do you mess up one of the most important origin moments in the entire story? What's really wild is that even Barry Jenkins, the director, hasn't exactly been shouting from Pride Rock about this one. And when the person who made the movie seems less than thrilled about it, well, that tells you something. Look, if you're planning a family movie night this holiday season, there are definitely other options out there. This isn't a terrible movie. The visuals are gorgeous, some of the voice acting is solid, and there are moments where you can see what it could have been. But it's like they took a 30-minute special and stretched it into a feature film, padding it with callbacks and cameos until it barely resembles the story it was trying to tell. Before you head out to see this one, let me know in the comments. What's your take on all these Disney prequels? Are there any that actually worked for you? Or is this just another cash grab in a long line of them? And while you're down there, if you enjoyed this breakdown, smash that like button and hit subscribe. It helps the channel more than you know, and it means you won't miss out on our next deep dive into Hollywood's latest attempts to milk our nostalgia dry.